from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
Welcome to the third program in our 5-week series titled A Universal Healthcare in America, Can We Do It? On this third program, our subtopic is the impact of violence on healthcare in America, and we could not be more fortunate than having the guests that we have to address this very serious topic. We welcome to the state of Idaho from Seattle, Washington, Dr. Roland Moreau, who is the director of the Harborview Anger Management and Domestic Violence Program and Associate Director of the Behavioral Medicine Clinic, both at Harborview Medical Center in Seattle. He is also an Associate Professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Washington School of Medicine. He received his BA degree in Psychology Biology from Rutgers University, his PhD in Clinical Psychology from Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, and then did postdoctoral studies at the University of Washington School of Medicine. In addition to his academic credentials, he is also a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of Washington. Our distinguished guest has gained international recognition as an expert on the assessment and treatment of anger problems and violent behavior, stress and coping, and community mental health. His work with these subject areas have included teaching, conducting numerous research projects, and doing extensive writing. He is currently editing a book titled The Handbook on Family Violence for Healthcare Professionals, as well as serving as the chief editor of the Journal of Violence and Victims, which is a multidisciplinary journal devoted to theory, research, and practice in the field of violence and victimization. Welcome to our program. We're very delighted to have you with us.
Thank you, Tony.
And as always, I'm very pleased to have our two regular panelists to continue this series on healthcare. First of all is Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is the other regular panel member, Steve Schenck, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College, and I shall ask Janelle Burke to commence the questioning.
Dr. Meyer, it's very nice to have you here to discuss this important subject. Really, we're talking about two things when we're talking about violence and how it affects healthcare in America. We're really talking about, is there more violence today? That's a first question. And then secondly, how does that affect healthcare? So to set the stage for our viewers, could you answer those two questions somewhat in a broad sense?
Well, I think year to year there's debate about whether there's more violence than there was last year. I think we need to look at the trend of increased violence over the past 20 to 30 years, and it's very clear that there has been increased violence in our communities, in our cities, large and small, across the United States over that time.
And how does that affect health care? When you have a battering or when you have a death, how does that affect health care?
We're just beginning to discover the impact that violence is having on health care as we're looking at how dollars are spent and how we can best spend them. We're coming to grips with the fact that violence takes a tremendous cost in our healthcare system. It is the leading cause of injury. Violence in the home, for example, is the leading cause of injury to women seen in most major emergency rooms across the country. We know that the cost, and we've done some studies at Harborview Medical Center, for repairing just the acute effects of gunshot wounds amount to about $17,000 per case. And where there's cases of spousal abuse or child abuse, the average is about $10,000 to $11,000 just for the immediate costs, not counting long-term disabilities that could accrue.
Now, you've talked about some really serious problems when you're talking about a gunshot wound or perhaps a broken limb, something of that nature. But what about just the cost of anger management, dealing with how people feel when they're very frustrated?
Yes.
Is there some cost to that as well?
There are costs. There's direct and indirect. There are various manifestations or responses to angry, abusive, and violent behavior. Not all of it shows up as physical injury. A lot of it will show up in a primary caregiver's office as an anxiety problem, as a depression problem, as a stress disorder of some sort. We know the emotion of anger itself is being increasingly recognized as something that takes its toll in terms of the cardiovascular health of both men and women.
And in terms of what can we do about this, is there something that can be done just in a very broad sense now at this point? Can anger be controlled?
Well, I think a lot of things can be done with anger. The first step is, of course, is to acknowledge it as an important emotion having implications for health care. Much has been learned about other types of emotions which are very basic or primary, like anxiety and depression. It's time that we admitted anger as an emotion on equal footing and as a subject of discussion socially, health-wise, and politically in our communities as well.
Steve Sheen.
I guess you have to look at anger as sort of a cause and violence as an effect. Are you, and we always, and I know this is unfair in a way as someone asking questions, but it seems there's a tendency to say, let's get to the root cause. Where's all this anger coming from? Have you been able to generalize that at all?
Well, first of all, violence is a complex phenomena, and it's caused by a variety of factors that include anger but go well beyond that. Anger in itself is not necessarily a problem. It's a normal human emotion that we all have. We really don't have to learn to be angry. Every 2-year-old, parents will know, is capable of being angry whether someone teaches them or not. A temper tantrum is part of a natural display. The expression of anger, and whether it becomes hurtful or destructive, is something that is learned, and certainly something that needs to be unlearned as part of social programming and moral development for all human beings.
Before the show started, we were talking, and what is it about age that seems to trigger that learning process? You mentioned, and I've already forgotten the exact age ranges, but anger and violence, certainly they're present at all times and in all areas of our society, at all ages of people, but they seem to group a lot from adolescence to early adulthood. What do we learn at age 24 or 25 or whatever it was that suddenly decreases the amount of anger and violence that we see?
Well, learning to deal with these emotions and impulses and behaviors is a lifelong learning process. We know if the lessons are not well taught, then all sorts of problems develop for that individual, the intimate people around them, and for the community at large. I think we know that every child needs to learn to manage anger, that issues of independence, dependence develop in adolescence, how you're going to develop a sense of power and esteem and accomplishment as an adult are all issues that intertwine with anger expression. And how to learn to resolve differences and conflict in a non-angry and non-violent way is a challenge for all of us. These are important lessons to be taught. I think the messages that we're getting is that we're not spending enough time on these messages, and we're not teaching the lessons very well.
Well, I can't forget that what we're focused on here, of course, is the health implications of anger and violence. But it occurred to me as we were talking that another real problem in the area of healthcare is substance abuse, and oftentimes substance abuse and youth are linked. Do you find in your study that those three things, violent behavior, young people, and substance abuse, go together?
Certainly they do. There's clusters of things that seem to fit together psychobiologically. We know that tendencies towards depression, unhappiness, anger, irritability, and the tendency to abuse drugs and alcohol seem to cluster together for many individuals. And this is a very active area of research about what is it about us, the way we're configured and constructed as human beings, that makes that so. And does that also lend to us potential tools that we could develop to assist people?
I would like to pursue something along that line that took place over lunch today that I thought was really interesting. We've had guests on this program over the years from your field that have disagreements on how much individuals can be impacted to change behavior throughout their life, and certainly you had some really articulate comments to make today. Would you share with our viewers the comparison of as people are born into this world and certain genetic characteristics that are involved versus environmental influence, and your theory on how we can change and process through life?
I think certain things are inherited or formed psychobiologically at an early age, and this is what we call temperament. And temperament is the way that we're inclined to react. And there's major differences between people as they're born into this world and as a product of the type of early experiences that they have. Do they form, are they nurtured, are they supported, are they loved? Do they form trusting attachments with other people? All of this configures how we're prone to react or respond, and this occurs at an early age. All children are born sort of half-baked into this world. The nervous systems are only partially developed, and they're very plastic. And the way children are fed, not only through basic eating, but also how they're fed emotionally or through socialization, has a lot to do with how people then become inclined. As the branch is bent, so the tree will grow. That, I think, is something that we need to recognize and work with. And then we look at a variety of social experiences and socialization experiences that then guide that process and either teach new lessons to manage those inclinations or maybe teach them in ways in which they're not managed.
Now, tying that together, I just think your comments are so powerful that if we really, through proper educational systems in the family and in the school and so forth, we're able to manage this in a very different way from the time a child was born. And over a period of time, we made a drastic change in how individuals behave, and that is the great reduction in violence. How would that impact health care in such a way? How would you react to this statement that there would be such a reduction in emergency health care that there would be adequate dollars to have universal coverage for everyone in a comprehensive way? Was that a reasonable statement?
The most common form of violence that we have in our country, withstanding all of the newsworthy stories that come out about gang violence and what have you, involves or stems from violence in the home. Domestic violence is the leading category of injury that is of an intentional nature that occurs to people. A woman, for example, is more likely to be repeatedly assaulted or raped or injured or killed in her own home than anywhere else in the community. These are very shocking statistics for some, but they have remained fairly constant over a good number of years now. We know that this form of violence presents itself in emergency rooms, in primary caregivers' offices, in a variety of presentations, physical injuries, stress disorders, and what have you. It's estimated that approximately 25 to 30% of the injuries presenting to emergency rooms are of an intentional interpersonal nature. The cost of this is great, and I've outlined a number of the costs. Repairing a gunshot wound on average is $17,000 for acute effects. Child abuse, about $10,000 to $11,000, and spousal abuse injuries, $10,000 to $11,000.
But the impact is so great, isn't it? Statistically, can we even gather it all? In addition to what you're discussing with the emergency care at the hospital, the follow-up that may require mental health treatment and so forth, and even in other arenas where there are divorces and so forth, and the court becomes involved, and then what happens to children? I guess there's really no way for us statistically to get at the level of the cost. So that's why I made the statement, did it have validity, that there would be many dollars available for other kinds of health care that do not have a relationship to violence?
Well, there would be. There's been an interesting study done recently at Harborview Medical Center looking at gunshot injuries, which have increased significantly over the past 5 years. And there's this whole notion of what are we going to do about guns? We have certain rights to have them. There's a lot of concern about the wrong people having them or the people who have them not acting responsibly with them. It's often said, well, you know, guns don't kill people, people kill people. Well, this study is very interesting in the sense that it took a look at the type of savings that might be accrued if you took all the people who injure each other with guns, allowed them to be violent with knives instead. So no expectations of a decrease in violence, just the method and instrument of violence. you would save, just at our medical center, we have projected out, given the number of cases we see, about $1,300,000 a year in cost, many of which end up being the public tab for this. If you project these figures at our trauma center across the country with similar type of emergency rooms, we're talking about a huge amount of money that would be in excess of $500 million, conservatively stated. So while we debate the issue of gun control, we know what damage and what toll it's taking and the price we're paying for not having it. And these monies could be available for other types of problems that people experience.
I guess I would interject here what some other experts have said, however, and that is it not a valid point to make that we really won't solve the problem in discussing just certain remedies if we don't get to the root of the problem. In other words, I would argue for the position that no matter what weapon that you use, if you don't get to the problem, there'll always be weapons found to engage in violence against people. I'm just suggesting to you that there is, from the time the child is born, I guess I'd ask you to respond to this. Sometimes I think we may be suggesting of treating the symptom rather than the problem.
Surely. And I'm not suggesting that we take the people who have guns and give them knives instead, or that we have some type of swap program. These sort of things are becoming popular these days, trading off one problem for another sometimes. I think what we do know is that a child who is exposed to, say, violence in the home has an 8 to 10 times likelihood of becoming a violent offender in the community. And this would be whether they establish a family of their own or whether they do not and become a general offender out there in the community. The amount of risk here in terms of this exposure is huge. Consider the fact, by comparison, that smoking, which we've all identified as a public health problem, increases the likelihood of heart disease by only twofold. We all feel there's a need to discourage smoking. If we discouraged violence in the home and exposure to it, and it has an 8 to 10 times likelihood increased risk, this is a tremendous opportunity for early intervention and prevention. And this is one of the reasons why I recommend, if we're going to start someplace, that we look at the home as the breeding ground for violence of a variety of types in the community, and we invest there. It makes sense from not only an economic point of view, but from a humane point of view to do this. It's an investment in our children, which we're becoming increasingly concerned about.
Thank you. Janelle.
I want to continue along that same line, and I know that one of your areas of expertise is violence in the home. How many times do you find that it continues from generation to generation? I know there are some statistics along that line.
There definitely appears to be a contagion. I think if someone is exposed to violence in the home, they're not condemned to relive those patterns, but the likelihood is much higher that they will enact out those same patterns. And if they don't become a perpetrator of such behavior, say with women who are less violent than men, it increases their likelihood that they will be a victim. Having been exposed to that same experience, they seem to become desensitized to it, incorporate it as part of how a family operates, and nothing new when it seems to happen later on in their own lives and their own relationship. So it has a number of effects. Effects upon delinquency. We know that people in prisons are overrepresented for these experiences, not all of them having this, but a variety of problems. Health problems in general seem to be related to this.
Now, the child who's in that home situation, do you find that they're more violent at school? And do some of these violence patterns come out?
Immediately, simply being exposed, a child has a twofold or 2 times likelihood of being a problem, a discipline problem at school, of getting poor grades, of not programming well and learning what they're supposed to learn, of having problems with peers, making friendships. That's immediately in childhood. As it develops into adolescence, the likelihood of entry into delinquency is about 4 to 5 times. Again, with this common experience. And then, of course, into adulthood is when the 8 to 10 times likelihood increased risk is really present.
What other kinds of things feed into this? Do groups, gangs, does that have an effect also upon the juvenile?
Certainly they do in a variety of ways. Gangs are both a symptom and a problem in their own right. Gangs have the property of developing a whole culture of their own, of entrapping individuals into antisocial lifestyles such that they get rewarded, at least in the short term, for being part of that group. They feel important, they feel a sense of belonging, but they're operating outside of the rules, and they're violating the standards of conduct for the community, sometimes lethally, taking each other's lives and other innocent bystanders being caught in the crossfire.
What do you find at Harborview are most of the incidents of violence that require health care? Are they the result of someone that the people knew, or are they just someone, the drive-by shooting kind of thing?
In most cases still, although the drive-by stranger-related violence is growing, violence between intimates tends to be the largest category of violent behavior, both in terms of injuries and homicides.
And in terms of the kids who are at home, do you think the media has had anything to do with where they come from?
Funny you should ask that question, Janelle, being a member of the media yourself. The media has come under scrutiny over the past few years, and for good reason. People wonder about the medium and the message there. People are concerned about the media and whether it's balanced and responsible. Some of my colleagues talk about the tabloid journalism and the sensationalism and how it feeds the morbid preoccupation and curiosity with respect to violence. And in my own view, it creates part of our culture and our window to the world, and it will sometimes give the picture that violence is going on at all times, constantly, in all ways, and that this is the way life is and this is the way it has to be. And I think in that way it can desensitize people and lead to them learning to accept violence as tolerable and something that we can't do anything about. I'm more critical of the notion that violence causes people to go out and be violent. I think most of our children, despite their young age, know the difference between fantasy and reality. And I don't think it's that simplistic at all, that that a image or a movie or a rock record or whatever leads directly to for people to be violent. I think we had a study that was published in Violence and Victims, and it showed that people who were already exposed to violence were prone to increasing their repertoires by watching violent media. But the direct link in terms of creating violence really wasn't demonstrated in that study.
Steve Sheen.
Dr. Meyer, if you're lucky enough to be working with a family that has had domestic violence problems, how do you counsel them to model a different kind of behavior, different way of managing and dealing with anger, which is going to occur in every family? Sure. How do you counsel them to do that appropriately within a family setting?
Well, we separate issues of anger, which are normal and can be healthy expressions of anger, from abusive and violent behaviors, which is not only a violation interpersonally between the people, but it's a crime against the community. It violates community standards. In Washington State, we have a mandatory arrest law. If you're violent towards someone, whether it be in your home or not or outside, this is a crime. This is a criminal assault. In my own view, this is appropriate. A crime should be a crime regardless of where it occurs, and certainly it should be enforced just as strongly, if not more so, where there are more vulnerable victims and available victims in the home. I work with people who come in referred by healthcare providers. I'm pleased that increasingly people self-refer through word of mouth and through community groups. But we also work with the criminal justice system to send the message that these behaviors are criminal or not going to be tolerated. Safety for victims is the first and foremost step to take, and we make sure that all family members are safe and have the appropriate supports.
But how people, as you said almost at the beginning of the show, are born different. And maybe the ideal situation would be a family where people sit down a la leave it to Beaver and just discuss things over the dinner table. But some people need to be more demonstrative. I mean, just physically they need to release some anger. Are there appropriate ways in the family that you can do that? I mean, is a loud argument always bad? Is it always bad to slam a door? Are those sorts of...
Not at all. These are very common behaviors, and we all survive them, and we all are familiar with them. These are not problems, and I really think that it's important for people, say in my line of work, not to overly pathologize normal and strong expressions of emotion. I think the issue becomes whether someone's physical health, their emotional well-being, or their freedom is compromised in some way, their rights violated, and whether it be children or adults, elder, all of that is not acceptable.
Let me ask one other quick question, and I'll let you get back to Tony. In a family situation where there has been a history of violent domestic dispute, and I'm thinking particularly of children, do your studies show that you can do something to help those young people, or once they're exposed to that, is the die cast for them?
I don't believe it is. I think we know that the majority of people exposed to these experiences seem to do okay. And it's not simply chance or accident. They do okay because there are positive healing and supportive forces in their lives. When you look at people who are survivors of these experiences, someone was there to offer a positive support and example for them, to give them opportunities to develop a sense of positive self-worth, to lead a healthy life. And that can be something that occurs within family, or it can occur through the facilitation of a professional to make those sort of experiences possible, or a teacher or clergy for that matter.
We have about a minute left, Dr. Meyer, and could you take just a minute to talk to physicians in our audience about some of the things they should look for when they suspect violence, or are they doing it enough?
Well, I think there's a call to arms going on in the medical community, not to simply treat injuries, but to look at the root causes of injury and of violence when a person comes in. It's important for a physician to know what the patterns and the signs are, to recognize them, and not to return the person who's coming in harmed or injured to the same environment from which that happened. We know that violence in the home, for example, continues unless there's intervention, and often it escalates to greater and more severe injury.
On that note, I have to bring it upon a conclusion. We just got started. Thank you very much for your time, and I know the panel and the staff join me in our appreciation.
Well, thank you for inviting me to be here.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you will join us again next week when we will do part 4 in this 5-week series on the issue of universal health coverage. On our next program, we're going to talk about the hard choices for health care in the future. I hope you'll be with us then. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.